Good evening. Good evening. Very good. I wonder if the lighting man would allow us to have a little bit more light on your lovely faces. Then I can see when you fall asleep. That's very good. My name is Peter Meadows. I'm your speaker for this evening. I realize that many of you would not know who I am, which is of great relief to you. I am married to Rosemary, who arrives on Thursday. She's a doctor's receptionist. And they are nice people, my wife tells me. I have five children. The eldest is 27, the youngest is nearly 16, and she's here. And I once had hair. And I'm deeply convinced there's some sort of relationship between this and my five children. I'm working it out. The only thing that I can rejoice in is that when my sons, of whom I have four, ridicule me for this, I just remind them that it is hereditary. We're working through Moses this week, but I'd like to begin with a story about two duck hunters from Michigan in America. It was winter, it was cold. They decided now was the time to go and shoot ducks. They took with them a very prized possession, which was their brand new Jeep Cherokee, a Jeep Grand Cherokee. It was eventually going to cost them how much was it? $30,000. It was a very, very expensive vehicle. They'd made their first payment, and they went off to shoot ducks. The two went, they were extremely bright and intelligent. They took with them their dog, their guns, some ammunition, a duck decoy thing, and a stick of dynamite. The dynamite was very important in this because the lake was frozen solid, very firm, very solid, very safe. But what they needed to do was to drive onto the lake and make an area of the lake free of ice where they could put their little decoy duck, so that the other unsuspecting ducks would come hovering down as ducks do land there, and they could destroy it and bring it back. The fuse on the dynamite, they discovered, was only going to last about 40 seconds. They were intelligent enough to realize that if you lit the fuse, dropped the dynamite and ran, you were not going to get away in time. So being very intelligent, they lit the fuse and threw it. Do you remember I mentioned the dog? You're beginning to get the picture. The dog was a highly trained retriever, which was soon scampering across the ice, grabbing hold of this stick of now fizzing dynamite in its teeth and coming towards them with bright eyes, bushy tail, wagging forward and saying, "Aren't I doing a good job?" The men began to panic. One of them said, "Shoot the dog, shoot the dog!" So he began firing these pathetic little bullets, which do damage for ducks and do nothing to dogs. But what it did do was create a sense of panic in the dog, who immediately, being very clever, said, "I need to find somewhere to take cover." You're with me. Within a few seconds, he was underneath this very expensive and brand new Jeep Grand Cherokee. At which point there was a very loud explosion, and the Cherokee went to the bottom of the pond, never to be seen again. And the insurance company said, "You are not insured when you play with dynamite." And out in front of me, there are hundreds of men who are mourning for that car, and two or three women who are saying, "What about the dog?" Let me put your mind at rest. The dog did live. Not for very long, but it did live. I wonder who you identify within that story. I wonder who within that story most strikes as being you. As you think about identifying, do you feel yourself much like the Cherokee Jeep that it's now bottom and submerged, never to return? Do you feel like that dog who went out believing that he was doing the very best he could, and suddenly life collapsed? Do you feel like those two men who went out innocently duck hunting, but realized that life was not going to be the same for them as where they began. As you come to a week like this, I wonder who you identify with most. I wonder who Moses would have identified with. You see, to him, the day we're considering today was a very ordinary day. It was much like the days he'd had for the last 40 years. He got up, brushed himself down, cleaned his teeth, done what you do, and gone off and looked after sheep. A very different kind of world to the one that he enjoyed in the palace before he ran away. But here he was, just getting on with life, doing those things that you do when you're a shepherd. And then he comes in front of the surprise of his life. He comes face to face with a burning bush. Worse than that, it's not only a burning bush, it's a bush that won't go out. And he watches it and watches it and watches it. Then life becomes even stranger because he hears it speak. Worse than that, it's his name that he's hearing. And Moses says to himself, I'm going up to have a look at this and see what's going on. And we read in Exodus 3, when the Lord saw that he got Moses' attention, God called him from the bush, Moses, Moses. Moses heard his name. Isn't it a shock to us that God knows our name and sometimes speaks to us? It strikes me that, have you ever been in a crowded airport, as I was recently, minding your own business, and over the tannoy you hear this voice that goes, Peter Meadows, and you go, it wouldn't bother you because you're not Peter Meadows, but I can assure you it worried me sick. That moment when in the huge crowds your name is mentioned. I have a friend who travels internationally. And whenever he's bored and waiting around airports for a long while, he goes over to the desk and says, I wonder if you would page, and he gives them his name. And he says, I wonder if you'd say that, would the party that's due to meet Mel Gibson, and he mentions his name. And he sits there, let's pretend his name's Fred Smith because I'm not going to embarrass you to know who it is. And he sits there in this huge airport lounge and hears, would Fred Smith, who's meeting Mel Gibson, please go to the information point? And he strolls off just to see how many other people have come to see if Mel Gibson's going to come or not. But there's this huge shock, isn't it, of hearing your name in public that you are known. I found something similar recently when I was driving down an obscure piece of motorway. I can't remember where it was. But they'd suddenly put up the registration numbers of cars to say you were traveling too fast. Have you ever been on that bit of road? I think it's somewhere down where Stuart lives. And I wanted to park my car and get out and look at my registration number to see if it was me. It's that moment of realization that you are being seen and known when you don't expect it. And God called Moses' name. And God is in the business of calling our name. We are intimately known to God personally. You may feel you are very insignificant. You are not insignificant to God. God knows your name. He knows you intimately from that moment before you were ever born. And whoever you are hearing my voice right now, whether in this big tent or back watching this on television as a parent or whoever, you need to understand that God knows your name, and that is good news. Maybe you have at some time heard God call your name for a big issue or a small issue, not in judgment, but in joy, whispering your name and saying that you are important to him and he has great plans for you. Or maybe this week is a time when it will happen. You see, we have created a program this week which particularly enables God to speak your name. If you come to the intersections morning by morning, you'll have opportunities to do what we're calling mission statements, to look at our lives in the light of God's word and the light of God's world and say, how does it match up? God, what might it be about my life that you want to make different and special and good, which will express your character in the world, make people think more about you, less about me? Put my name on it. There are great opportunities this week for God to speak your name in love and for you to respond. God speaks our name. And when God spoke his name, the name to Moses, the beginning was very good news. The truth is, whenever God speaks our name, it is always good news. Sometimes, in the short term, it may not seem it. But here's Moses in front of the bush, and God says to him, I have seen the misery of my people. And Moses says, that's brilliant. Here have I been for 40 years in a wilderness, knowing my people are suffering, knowing those people of my birth have been under the cudgel by the Egyptians. Here have I been anxious, and you, God, you're telling me that you've seen them. God goes on, I've heard their cries for deliverance. And Moses says, God, that's wonderful. You've not only seen them, you've heard their cries. What an encouragement that is to my heart to know that you, the great God of creation and the universe, are on their case. God says, yes, he says, I'm aware of their suffering. So I've come to rescue them and lead them out of Egypt. And Moses says, that is brilliant news. It's the news I've been waiting for. God, you have made my day. And then God says, now you go. Because I'm sending you, Moses, to Pharaoh so that you will lead my people out of Egypt. And good news becomes a moment of seeming terror for Moses. And Moses finds himself in a moment of decision. It's a decision I hope that everyone has met or will meet a number of times in our journey with God through our lifetime. Yes, there will be great moments for many of us where God calls us to do something distinct and special. It may not be written over headlines, it may not be great events, it may be seemingly insignificant to the world, but to you it will be very significant. But you know, our lives are made up of many moments like that, when we allow God to speak our name and we respond in a positive way to make a difference. You see, if God has met us in Jesus, if Jesus has become the person who has transformed our lives by bringing us forgiveness and new life, and God has poured his life into us and made us like Jesus, then we are part of Jesus' body. We're part of being the equipment to do the things that Jesus wants to do. We are those people that loves the world because God loves through us. So it's not a matter of simply having our fire insurance for heaven paid for. We become forgiven and then we wait for heaven to come while we go through life's motions. God has got a great plan for us as the people of God who now know Jesus. It's to transform our world, it's to transform our society, it's to show the character of God in the things we do, the way we behave, and in every area of our lives. And that's going to have an impact, and it's good news. Everything about the gospel of the Lord Jesus is good news, and we are called to be that good news with him. If you get a moment as soon as you can, when you've got hold of your study guide for the morning intersections, turn to the last 4 or 5 pages, because they are littered with examples of ordinary people like you and me who have heard God speak their name and who have responded by saying yes in ordinary seemingly ways which have made a difference to their world and the world as a whole. When God speaks our name, it's to send us as he calls us. God says, I am sending you. But let's keep it in proportion, because I don't want us to imagine that the only time God speaks our name is when something extraordinary is about to happen. Yes, he will call people this week to serve him overseas or in some dramatically different way in our own nation. Maybe you've come here and that has been your experience. Maybe right now, as you hear my voice, you're aware that this could be a culmination of something that God has been preparing for you and saying for you down past months and years. But maybe there are just issues where God is saying, I'm looking for a renewed commitment from you. There is a step forward I need. Life simply isn't the way it really should be if I'm going to be Lord and King of your life. This is a week. This is a moment when you need to know that I am saying your name and I'm wanting you to respond. It may be that there's some simple, basic area of trust in your life and mine, where God is calling us to respond and say, yes, you can have whatever you want of me. But of course, it could also be some major step in the future. Maybe it has happened to you. You've heard God call your name. What I want to share in the next few minutes is really appropriate for you because it helps you to make the response you need to make. But what I'm sharing tonight is also very relevant because if during these intersections or in other places during this week or in your life to come, there comes a moment where God says, I'm whispering your name, then this is the equipment which enables you to respond with reality in the way that Moses responded. You see, there are three issues that which will always affect our response when God speaks our name. The first is who we are. The second is who God's is. And the third is God's promise to be with us. The first thing we need to understand when God speaks our name is who we are. Not by name, but who we are. That's what Moses did. God said, Moses, Moses. And Moses' first response is, but who am I? Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? How can you expect me to lead the Israelites out of Egypt? I want to tell you folks, he was asking the right question. Why me is the most appropriate question ever to ask when we sense God has got a call on our life. The great question. Because, inadequacy is the first step for Christian service. Say that after me, will you? Inadequacy is the first step for Christian service. Say it as though you really mean it. Inadequacy is the first step for Christian service. You know the most dangerous people in God's kingdom? The people who say, God, thank you for calling my name. Where have you been? I've been waiting for this because I'm just the material you need. I've got the gifts and abilities and talents. What took you so long? Instead, the sort of people need are the people who say to God, really, I'm not sure if I'm up to it. It was the great question. Too many people say I'm there. I remember a time as a young man in a small Bible class in a little Brethren church in West Ealing where I got the job of leading the Bible class. And I said, God, I don't know what took you so long to figure out I was the right person for the job. I had hair. I was culturally relevant. I knew enough guitar chords to sing Kumbaya. If you're into Friends, I even knew the claw. I knew the stuff. And I went into that situation really believing that God was very fortunate to have me serve him in that little place. It probably took me about 2 months to realize I'd fallen flat on my face and my response was totally inadequate and inappropriate. The truth is that I needed to have understood at the beginning, why me? It's our inadequacies, or our sense of inadequacies, which are the greatest resource God could use. How did Moses see himself? If you've come across a book by Max Lucado, When God Whispers Your Name, and if you haven't, I would encourage you to get hold of it. He draws a parallel between Moses and someone in the book who is the same story, but it paints it differently. It's someone who's now elderly, whose job is to clean an office when everyone's gone home. He does the 3 o'clock shift with his mop and his bucket and diligently cleans the floors and never sees no one, and he's done it for 20 years. He's old, he's decaying, his eyes will hardly see, and he's there because there was something many years earlier that went severely wrong. And now they talked, and now he is there. And he feels life is finished. It is all over. There is nowhere to go. And then the mop bucket starts to glow red and a voice comes and calls his name and recommissions him. And he stands there saying, why me? And it could be as you've come to a spring harvest, you feel that it's very appropriate to be worshiping, very appropriate to be happy, but somehow that's all you're ever going to do. That somehow you're left on the shelf, you don't have the gifts or the talents or the abilities to do something that's worthwhile for God. Paul writes to the church in Corinth and says this, remember, few of you were wise in the world's eyes, or powerful, or wealthy when God called you. Instead, hear this, God deliberately chose what the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they're wise. And he chose those who are powerless to shame those who are powerful. God chose things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers as important, so that no one can ever boast in the presence of God. When God calls our name to service, when God calls our name to respond to him in some way, large or small, he calls weak people through whom he can show his extraordinary power. He chooses ordinary people and does extraordinarily things through them so that people can see. I always look forward to the week at Spring Harvest when we have our special friends here from Prospects, because Jesus shines through them in a way which I find extraordinary. God has spoken to me so many times through the simple faith of people who are childlike but with adult bodies that it chills me to think. God blesses and uses them, the seeming foolish things. If he can use them, why not us? You see, you don't need much to make a difference. There was a 12-year-old girl who, armed only with a stopwatch in San Francisco, cost the parking department £1 million. How did she do it? She timed 2,300 parking meters. I love her to death. But can you imagine if one 12-year-old girl armed only with a stopwatch can make that kind of difference? Can you imagine what God can do with inadequate people like us if we respond? My neighbor has got a sort of a plastic windmill thing stuck on his fence, which whenever I see it, God speaks to me through it. You may have seen them. It's a kind of a plastic windmill with a drive shaft, and this little plastic man who's got his hands on the drive shaft, which looks like a handle. And what happens is when the wind blows, the spindles turns, and this man moves like the clappers. And I look at him and think, I know what's going through his brain. He's saying to himself, aren't I doing well? He's there with his hands moving on this, figuring that I'm moving this, the spindle's moving, that's moving. I bet he actually at times figures, this is making the wind blow. We can imagine that's how life is. Friends, when God calls our name, all he wants to do is to blow the wind of his Spirit through us so that we can do the things he wants us to do. Inadequacy is the first starting point of serving God. The second thing that Moses needed to understand, he had to face his true identity. Who was he? Who is he? Lord, why me? Who me? Why me? Was he a prince of Egypt? Or was he a prince of God? You'll be aware that Moses was born into a priestly family. But here he is, having brought up in the palace with all the riches and the privileges and power that it came. Who did he belong to? Even there as he stood in the desert. To go back into that situation in Egypt meant that he had to own up to who he was. How well do we own up? Did you have that conversation before you came away? As a friend or a neighbor or someone in workplace said, where are you going? And you said, to the East Coast. And they said, isn't that where Butlins is? And you went, oh, is it? Oh, yes, Butlins, oh, yes. I have a wife a little similar to that. We live in a place called Chessington, which is not very wonderful. But just down the road is this beautiful village called Claygate. And I was at this dinner party with my wife a few years ago when someone said, where are you from? And she really wanted to say, Chessington. But if you've seen the film Liar, Liar, you'll know there's the moment in the film where the hero or whatever is wanting to say blue, but he can only say red. And I noticed Rosemary doing that. She really wanted to say that she was from Chessington, but she knew that there was sort of the image problem. And I heard her say, oh, I'm from North Claygate. We still get letters addressed to North Claygate. The postman now understands it. Who do we own up to being? Who do we own up to being? Who do we own up to being? I've got to be honest, there are times when I find it hard to put my head up above the parapet. It's when the person looks you in the eyes and says, oh, are you a born again then? I say, it depends what you mean by a born again. They say, well, we've got one in our office. I say, oh, so what's a born again like? Oh, they said, born agains are people who look miserable when we come around and collect the lottery money. And it's at that point I decide I don't want to be a born again. Do you understand me? I say, well, leave your label off for a minute. Can I tell you that if you want to put a label on me, I'm someone that has discovered that Jesus Christ is the most significant person in history and has transformed my life along with millions of others, and I follow him with every bit that I've got. I find that much more comfortable than putting labels on. But the issue is, Moses needed to own up who he was. Who was he? Was he prepared to stand up and say, I am identifying with my people? You see, there's a lot of cultural stuff that I find very difficult to own as a Christian, I'll be honest. Because we've added so many trappings that make it complicated. But I do want people to know that the God of Moses is my God, and that I will honor him with every bit of my life that I can give. But please don't always label me, because sometimes the label I'm wearing is the same as someone else is wearing, and that may not always be helpful. But the issue is, am I prepared to stand up and say who my God is and the fact that I own him clearly before them? That was the challenge to Moses. He also, in terms of understanding who he was, needed to know that he was not disqualified. Can you imagine Moses standing there in front of the bush and hearing God speak his name, when as far as he was concerned, his walk with God had been jettisoned long before? You see, it was 40 years earlier that he'd taken his life and others' life into his own hands. Through an act of compassion, he'd seen injustice, but he'd overstepped the mark and had killed. The word had got out. He'd fled for safety. Now he was a long way both from his true people, his adopted people. He was off in the desert. And where was God? The very thought that God would call his name was a shock to him, and it may be to you this week. But Moses needed to know that he was not disqualified from following God. And we need to know that too. Yes, there are times when certain kinds of sin mean that we need to be set aside for a while and may disqualify us from certain kinds of leadership. Understand what I'm saying now against that context, will you? But in God's economy, God is looking for more reasons to use us than he's looking for excuses not to. Moses needed to know that he was not disqualified, and you need to know that too. And I need to know that too. What about the issue of age? He is Moses, and Moses is 80 years of age. He is no longer a young liar. He's assuming that it's all over. He's assuming that life is done. He's assuming that there's nothing more for him. It's an issue for me. I was 36 when the first spring harvest happened. That was 21 years ago. You can do your sums. I am no longer middle-aged because I do not know any people who are twice the age that I am. We need to know that we are not disqualified by the age that we've got. Turn to the person next to you and say, you are not past your sell-by date. Just do that for me. And then add, even though you look it. No, don't say that. One of my heroes is a man called Lindsay Glegg, now dead, who at the age of 70 had a vision to hold Christian events on Butlin's premises. At the age of 70, he dreamed a brand new dream. There's been a lot of talk about older people handing on the baton to younger people. Can I tell you, I'm not intending to hand on any baton. Can I tell you why? Because when you hand on a baton, you stop running. I have no intention of stopping running, and I hope you haven't either, because age never disqualifies us from serving God. What you do is, as you run around the track, you make sure as your legs get tired, you move over so the young guys behind you and the young women behind you can lap you. That's fine. But there's no sense that we should be handing down and stopping running and switching off. I have 3 promises I've made myself. I want to live long enough to cause my children great worry. I want to be buried in an Hawaiian shirt wearing sunglasses, preferably Ray-Bans. And I want a Zimmer frame on which is engraved, "Let my people go." And I want to tell you that however old you are here, you are not disqualified from hearing God's voice and responding to what he says. Do you know what I've done recently? Do you understand the concept of jump leads? I found a younger guy and I fixed jump leads to him. One day you'll meet Joseph Steinberg. He's a guy in his mid-30s. He's bright. And the two of us have been working together recently on writing a fresh evangelistic book. And people have looked at the book, which is called Beyond Belief. It's about the only evangelistic book I would ever give to someone who wasn't yet a believer. And people look at it and say, there's lots of funny, wild stuff in there. Joseph must have written that. I want to tell you that I wrote some of those too, because I don't believe there's any reason why any of us should cease to be relevant with our advancing years. But the challenge is how we move out of the way and get the young lions to lap us as we go. The other thing that Moses needed to understand was not only was he not disqualified by anything that he got, but also that he had what God was looking for. He had what God was looking for. Now that's not a matter of pride. You see, it might be that God has exactly, that you have exactly what God is looking for. And it's not pride to have. See, think about the distinct history that Moses had. Think of the language he spoke. Egyptian, fluently. Think of the experience he'd had, being brought up in the Egyptian palace. Think what equipped him to serve God, which was distinct and special to him. He spoke Pharaoh's language. The past was an invaluable for the present. What language do you speak? What is the language from your past that makes you distinctly usable in God's service? What pains or disappointments or tragedies or journeys have you been through that make you distinctly usable in God's service? Where are your broken moments that allow you to stand alongside someone who is equally broken? It was only a few weeks ago I stood at a dinner party with a few people. There was one guy I noticed how quiet he was. And most of my friends don't yet know Jesus yet. I find them a lot of fun. And this was the group I was among. And as we began to talk, I asked him what he did, and he mentioned computers and this, that, and the other. And then there came that moment when I said to you, do you commute? Do you work nearby? And he said, well, actually, he said, just 2 weeks ago, they asked me to leave my job. And I was able to say, isn't that the pits? And talk to him about my own experience a few years ago of having exactly the same thing happen. I can empathize in what it meant to stand in a dole queue, the indignity of signing off. And the conversation we had was the beginning of a journey, and I realized that my past was usable as part of God's present or future. What have you got that God's looking for? What is it you've got that makes it important? My wife Rosemary suffered depression, severe depression, for 5 or 6 years. That is part of our past, which makes us speak the language of other people. What have you got? Childlessness, bereavement, disappointment, suffering, pain. What can you use? What God can use in your circumstances and stories? And then what qualities did Moses have? Moses needed to recognize that he had qualities God was looking for. Why did he get himself into trouble? Because he had a concern for justice. Why had he been taken in among this group of people who were shepherds and been taken into the family? Because he cared enough to fend off the shepherds and to make sure that the young women got water for their sheep, and he helped them. He had this inbuilt compassion. What is the compassionate areas of your life that God wants to use? What are the things you are concerned about? What are the things that make you just feel hurt? And be clear that if God calls you, he won't add compassion after he calls you. Your call will come out of the compassion you have. The third thing Moses needed to understand was it was the right moment. It was the right moment. He could have said, why is it in 40 years this bush has not spoken to me earlier? And God gives him the answer. He says, because all of those people who wanted to kill you, if they could get their hands on you, are now dead. It's safe for you to go where you need to go. You sit there listening to my voice and you say, why now and what not then? The answer is because for some reason that you may not know, this is your moment. We also need to understand, as Moses did, who God is. See, it's not enough to understand who we are. We need to understand who God is. That's why God gave Moses this great revelation of who he was. He used this astounding phrase, I am, which the translators find a real pig to translate. They do their best with phrases like that I am what I am. I am the one who always is. I will be what I will be. I am and always have been and always be. But what God did was blow Moses away by saying, I'm not the God who was then. I am the God with no beginning and no end. I am the forever God. And there's no way we'll understand God calling our name unless we can put it in the context of who God is. Imagine a page of a book for a moment. And there is a whole bunch of words. Joseph Steinberg showed me this. Imagine that page represented the universe. And imagine the letters on it were the stars and the planets. Where would you picture God? Where would you picture God? Somewhere in there? Behind Mars or Venus or Jupiter? Just there? Start again. Start with a blank sheet of paper in your mind. Imagine that page is God, which is hard to do because you'll be thinking about a page with no edges, because God has no beginning or end. But you see, there was a time when all there was God. There was nothing to be created. All that existed was God, and then he created. Where did God put what he created? There was nowhere to put it other than within himself. That means the God who speaks your name is bigger than the galaxies, which are forever expanding, and for time, bigger than time itself. The God who calls your name is a God so huge that when he says, go and I will be with you, you have everything going for you you possibly can have. Let me read some words to you as I close. They're words that came across to me across the internet a few days ago, which remind us about what this God is who goes with us. When he calls your name, if he calls your name, this is your God. God is Lord Almighty, omnipotent King, Lion of Judah, Rock of Ages, Prince of Peace, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Provider, Protector, Leader, Ruling Lord, the reigning King of the universe. This God is the first and the last, the beginning and the end. He's the keeper of creation, the creator of all he keeps. He is the architect of the universe and the manager of all times. This God who calls our name always was and always is and always will be, unmoved, unchanged, undefeated, and never undone. He was bruised and brought us healing. He was pierced and eased our pain. He was persecuted and brought us freedom. He was dead and brought to life. He has risen and brings power. He reigns and brings peace. The world cannot understand him. The armies cannot defeat him. The schools cannot explain him. The leaders cannot ignore him. Herod couldn't kill him. The Pharisees couldn't confuse him. The people couldn't hold him. Nero couldn't crush him. Hitler couldn't silence him. The New Age can't replace him, and TV talk shows cannot explain him away. He is light, love, longevity. He is Lord. He is goodness, kindness, gentleness, and God. He is holy and righteous and powerful and pure. His ways are right. His word is eternal. His will is unchanging. And his mind is on you and me. He's my Redeemer. He's my Savior. He's my guide. He's my peace. He's my joy. He's my comfort. When I fall, he lifts me up. When I fail, he forgives me. When I'm weak, he's strong. When I'm lost, he is the way. When I'm afraid, he is my courage. When I stumble, he steadies me. When I'm hurt, he heals me. When I'm broken, he mends me. When I'm blind, he leads me. When I'm hungry, he feeds me. When I face trials, he is with me. When I face persecution, he shields me. When I face loss, he provides for me. When I face death, he carries me home. He is everything for everybody, everywhere, every time, in every way. God is in control. I am on his side. And that means all is well. When God speaks your name, then tomorrow, this week, you are not disqualified. He speaks your name because you are eminently qualified because of what he's done, and because the magnificent God of the universe will go with you wherever you go. And as for me, I'm going to go to my Zimmer frame and engrave on those words, let my people go. Let's do that this week.